On a cold Friday evening in March of 1959, a 9-year-old girl walked out of her home carrying 7 small boxes of mints. She had a route. She knew her neighborhood. She'd done this before. But in less than 2 hours, she'll be gone forever. What happened over the next 16 days would summon 1,200 searchers, 3 military aircrew to their deaths, and 750 tips from ordinary citizens, drifters, and self-proclaimed psychics. It would become, in the words of the detective who finally cracked it, the Mount Everest of American cold cases. This is the story of how one ordinary Friday destroyed hundreds of lives, haunted an entire city for over 6 decades, and remained unsolved until a breakthrough so unexpected, so shocking, that when the truth finally emerged in 2021, 62 years later, it would shake Spokane to its core. 62 years of a mother wondering. 62 years of a city flinching every time a child walked home alone. 62 years of a killer's name sitting completely unknown, unwritten, unsuspected, while he lived out the rest of his short life just a few miles from where he left her. This is the story of Candy Rogers. And I need you to pay close attention, because there's a detail early on, something small, something that seems like nothing, that won't make sense until the very end. Keep it in mind. You'll need it later. But to understand what happened, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when Candy Rogers was just a normal kid, living a normal life, about to do something thousands of kids did every single day in 1959. Something that should have been completely safe. Keep this in mind, because what seems innocent right now won't seem innocent for much longer. Let's go back to Spokane, Washington. March 6, 1959. Candace Elaine Rogers, everyone called her Candy, was 9 years old. A 4th grader at Holmes Elementary School. She lived with her mother in an apartment above a small grocery store on West Mission Avenue in a working-class neighborhood called West Central. And like a lot of little girls in America that year, Candy belonged to the Bluebirds, the youngest branch of the Campfire Girls. It was fundraiser season. Every Bluebird in Spokane had been handed a stack of small boxes of mints to sell door to door in her own neighborhood. Candy had 7 boxes. 7 small boxes, and a short list of houses she already knew. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, she stepped outside. Alone. On a quiet residential street, in a quiet American city, in an era when nobody thought twice about a 9-year-old walking a few blocks by herself. She was blonde. Blue-eyed. And by every account, an easy kid to like. She did not make it home. As the sky went dark that Friday evening, her mother's mild concern hardened into panic. Neighbors were asked. Nobody had seen her. The family started walking the block. Then running it. And when running turned up nothing, they called the police. Here's where the timeline turns sharp. By 9 o'clock that same night, just hours after Candy set out with her mints, volunteers combing the neighborhood found something. Boxes. Her boxes. Scattered along a road that ran south, toward the Fort George Wright Bridge, in a pattern that looked less like a little girl had dropped them, and more like they'd been thrown from a moving vehicle. Sit with that for a second. Within hours of a child going missing, searchers had already found evidence suggesting she didn't wander off. She didn't get lost. Someone had taken her, and moved her, fast, away from her own street. By the next morning, March 7th, it wasn't a family's private nightmare anymore. It was the whole city's. The disappearance hit the front page. And what began as a knock on a few neighbors' doors exploded into one of the largest search operations Spokane had ever mounted. Police. Firefighters. Off-duty servicemen. Total strangers who simply couldn't stay home. A command post went up near where Pettet Drive meets what's now the TJ Minack Bridge, and from there, roughly 1,200 people fanned out on foot, on horseback, in cars, combing riverbanks and back roads for any trace of a 9-year-old in a blue coat. The U.S. Air Force joined in too. Airmen from nearby Fairchild Air Force Base volunteered search crews, including a helicopter to scan the terrain from above. And this is where the story takes its first devastating turn, because the search itself was about to claim lives before it ever found Candy. On March 7th, the day after she vanished, an Air Force Sikorsky H-19 helicopter, carrying 5 servicemen who were combing the search zone from the sky, clipped a set of high-tension power lines above the Spokane River. It went down instantly. 3 airmen were killed. 2 more survived, pulled from the wreckage. 3 men who woke up that morning intending to help find a missing little girl never made it home themselves. Spokane hadn't found Candy, and now it had 3 more families grieving alongside hers. This is where things started going wrong in a way nobody could have predicted. A tragedy stacked directly on top of a tragedy in the very first 24 hours. And still, no Candy. The search didn't stop. If anything, the helicopter crash seemed to harden the city's resolve. Newspapers ran her photo daily. Volunteers kept combing the woods northwest of town. The Spokane River got dragged. Fields got walked, inch by inch. Police fielded call after call. A girl spotted here, a suspicious car seen there, and every single one led nowhere. Days turned into a week. A week turned into 2. And somewhere out there, in the cold March woods outside a city that hadn't stopped looking for her for a single day, the truth about what happened to Candy Rogers sat completely undiscovered. Because here's the thing about this case that makes it so haunting. The man responsible for what happened to her was never once a suspect. Not that week. Not that year. Not for the next 6 decades. He wasn't on a list. He wasn't questioned. His name didn't appear in a single police file. He would go on to live an entire adult life, get married, have a daughter, build a home just a few miles away, while an entire city searched for the girl he'd taken, and while detective after detective, generation after generation, hit the exact same wall. Now, remember those mint boxes? The ones scattered on the road the very first night, like they'd been thrown from a moving car? Keep that piece of evidence in mind. It's not the last time it's going to matter. Because 16 days after Candy Rogers disappeared, 2 men hunting in the woods northwest of Spokane were about to find something that would answer one question about this case, and detonate 100 more. 16 days. For 16 days, the city of Spokane had not stopped looking. Search parties kept walking grid patterns through the forests and canyons northwest of town, long after most missing persons cases would have quietly gone cold. This one didn't. Because everyone, police, volunteers, total strangers, understood on some level that a 9-year-old girl doesn't just vanish into thin air. Something had happened to her. And somewhere, the answer was sitting in the dirt, waiting to be stepped on. On March 21, 1959, 2 airmen from Fairchild Air Force Base were out hunting, not even officially searching, just hunting, in a wooded area off Old Trails Road, roughly 7 miles from Candy's home. And in the underbrush, they came across something that stopped them cold. A pair of small shoes. A little girl's shoes. They didn't know for certain whose they were. They couldn't have. But they knew exactly what it might mean, and they knew exactly what to do. They carried the discovery back to base, and they couldn't stop talking about it. By the time daylight broke the next morning, word had reached Spokane police, and a search party descended on that stretch of woods with a grim, specific purpose. They didn't have to search long. Just minutes in, searchers found her. Buried under a shallow pile of pine needles and tree boughs, roughly 200 yards from an abandoned rock quarry, about 130 feet off the road. 16 days after she left her house with 7 boxes of mints, Candy Rogers was found. The search was over. And the real horror was only just beginning to surface. The autopsy confirmed what investigators had feared from the very first night, from the very first scattered box of mints on that road. Candy hadn't wandered off and gotten lost. She hadn't had an accident. She had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death, killed with a strip of her own clothing used as a ligature, her feet bound with another strip torn from what she'd been wearing that day. A city that had spent over 2 weeks holding on to hope now had to process something almost unbearable. Their search hadn't ended in a rescue. It had ended in a crime scene. And here's a detail worth sitting with. This was 1959. DNA testing as we understand it today didn't exist. It wouldn't be developed for another 3 decades. Forensic science was fingerprints, blood type, and careful, patient observation. And yet, the investigators on scene that day did something that would turn out to matter more than any of them could have possibly imagined. They collected and preserved biological evidence from Candy's clothing. Evidence they had no way of testing. Evidence whose usefulness wouldn't exist for over 60 years. Keep this piece of evidence in mind. because it won't make sense until much later. A tiny act of diligence, performed by investigators in 1959 with 1959 tools, was quietly setting a trap that wouldn't spring shut until most of them were no longer alive to see it. But in the spring of 1959, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was finding whoever did this, and fast. Spokane's entire 230-man police force threw itself at the case. It was, by every account, unlike anything the department had handled before. Tips poured in, not dozens, not hundreds, but 750 of them, ranging from credible eyewitness accounts to tips from what one report dryly described as Skid Row bums and tea leaf readers. Everyone in Spokane, it seemed, had a theory. And slowly, a suspect began to emerge. His name was Hugh Byron Morse. Morse wasn't just a person of interest, he was, by any definition, a monster. A serial killer eventually tied to at least 4 murders, including 2 women right there in Spokane. He had a habit that seemed, at the time, uncannily relevant. He chewed grape-flavored gum. And when investigators re-examining the evidence noticed a stain on Candy's clothing that appeared to be gum, with what they believed was a faint grape smell, it felt like a lock clicking into place. 4 years, Morse sat at the center of Spokane's theory of the crime. He was already behind bars, serving a life sentence for 2 other homicides from 1959 and 1960. It made a horrible kind of sense. A predator already active in the area, already killing, already caught. Case practically solved, except it wasn't, because nobody could ever make it stick. No confession. No hard physical link. Just a stain and a hunch. And it turns out that hunch was leading them somewhere false. Morse wasn't the only name that surfaced. There was another one, a man named Alfred Graves, who reportedly kept a disturbing collection of newspaper clippings about the rape of women and children. On paper, he looked like exactly the kind of person capable of this. But Graves would never sit across from a detective in an interrogation room, because on the very day Candy's body was discovered, March 22, 1959, Alfred Graves died by suicide. Think about the timing of that for a second. The same day the city finally found her, one of its most disturbing potential suspects took his own life. It's the kind of detail that feels like it should mean everything. And for 62 years, nobody could prove that it meant anything at all. 2 suspects. 2 dead ends. And a case that was about to do something far worse than stay unsolved. It was about to be forgotten by everyone except the people who couldn't afford to forget it. Years went by. The 1960s came and went. The 1970s. The case aged out of living memory for most of Spokane, filed away in evidence boxes and yellowing binders while the detectives who'd worked it retired, and in some cases, passed away, never learning the truth. But it wasn't forgotten by everyone. In the early 2000s, decades after Candy's murder, forensic science had finally caught up to that quiet decision made back in 1959. The one where investigators carefully preserved biological evidence they had no way to test. Scientists were now able to isolate a semen sample from Candy's clothing and develop something called an STR profile, a genetic fingerprint that could, theoretically, be matched against a suspect. They ran it against Hugh Morse, the leading suspect. The grape gum. The stain everyone had pinned their hopes on for decades. It didn't match. Morse, the man Spokane had quietly believed, for years, was responsible, was excluded. He hadn't done it. The city's best theory, the one piece of narrative logic that had held the case together since the 60s, collapsed in an instant. And just like that, the investigation was back to nothing. Worse than nothing, actually, because now they had a genetic profile with no name attached to it. A ghost in the evidence room. Proof that someone out there had done this, sitting uselessly in a file because there was no database, no match, no lead to chase. For the next several years, that's exactly where it stayed. Investigators would periodically revisit the file. New detectives would inherit the binders, read through 750 decades-old tips, and ultimately reach the same conclusion every one of their predecessors had: no new plausible suspect. In 2007, a Spokane detective named Brian Hammond sat down for a local news interview about the case, one of many whatever happened to pieces that had run over the years, always circling back to the same unsatisfying answer: we still don't know. Hammond made an observation that stuck with people. He said the murder had changed something fundamental about the city. The way parents thought about letting their kids roam free, walk to a friend's house, sell mints door to door alone. A single afternoon in 1959 had quietly rewritten the rules of childhood for an entire community, and nobody had ever been made to answer for it. Before that interview ended, Hammond said something else, something almost like a promise, or maybe a prayer. He said someday, some detective would solve this case. He had no way of knowing how right he'd be, or how long it would actually take. Because the technology that would finally crack this case wide open didn't exist yet. Not in 2007, not for another decade after that. It was still being invented, quietly, in labs that had nothing to do with Spokane, Washington, built for a completely different purpose, and it would take a stroke of very modern science to finally catch a killer who had been sitting, unnoticed, in plain sight since 1959. But this is where everything changed. By the early 2020s, a new kind of forensic science had emerged, one most people had never heard of a decade earlier, and one that was about to rewrite the entire cold case landscape across the United States. It was called investigative genetic genealogy. Instead of matching DNA to a known suspect in a criminal database, this method compared crime scene DNA against consumer genealogy databases, the same kind of services people use to build family trees and find long-lost cousins, to identify relatives of a suspect, then work backward, branch by branch, until a single name fell out of the tree. It had already cracked some of the most infamous cold cases in the country. And in February 2021, the Spokane Police Department decided it was time to try it on the case that had haunted the department for longer than most of its officers had been alive. They reached out to a private forensic laboratory in Texas called Othram, a company that specialized in exactly this kind of work, pulling usable genetic information out of degraded, decades-old evidence that traditional labs couldn't touch. In March of 2021, Othram received the sample. And it was a mess. The DNA extract from Candy's clothing was over 60 years old, degraded, contaminated with non-human DNA, exactly the kind of specimen that would have been declared a dead end by older technology. But Othram scientists used a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing to do something that would have sounded like science fiction to the detectives of 1959. They built a full genealogical profile out of what was left. They fed that profile into genealogy databases. And the search began to narrow. It didn't lead to one name right away. It led to three brothers, somewhere out there in the family tree, whose combined genetic signature matched what had been recovered from Candy's body. 3 men, any one of whom could have been the person who took her. Investigators started digging into all 3. And that's when they hit their first real break. Only one of the 3 brothers had ever had children. A daughter. His name was John Ray Horf. And he had never once, in 62 years, been a suspect. Sergeant Zach Storment, the detective now leading the case, would later put it bluntly, Horf wasn't in a single police report. Not a witness statement. Not a passing mention. He was, in Storment's words, nowhere in print, completely off the radar, until the moment Othram's report landed on a Spokane detective's desk on September 6, 2021. Investigators approached Horf's surviving family. And what happened next is one of the more remarkable turns in this entire case, because his daughter, a woman named Kathy, didn't resist. When she learned her father was a suspect in the 1959 murder of a 9-year-old girl, she volunteered her own DNA to help police confirm or rule him out. On September 8, 2021, a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, Brittany Wright, delivered the result. Candy's crime scene DNA was 2.9 million times more likely to be related to Kathy's DNA than to a random member of the general population. 2.9 million times. It wasn't a maybe. It was, for all practical purposes, a certainty. John Ray Horf was the father of the DNA left behind at the scene of Candy Rogers' murder. There was just one problem. Investigators needed to confirm the match directly, not through a daughter's DNA, but through Horf himself. And Horf had been dead for over 50 years. On September 23, 2021, Spokane police obtained a search warrant for something almost nobody expects to hear in a modern investigation: John Ray Horf's grave. Detectives exhumed his remains, extracted a direct DNA sample, and ran the comparison against the profile pulled from Candy's clothing all those decades earlier. It was a match. 62 years, 6 months, and 17 days after Candy Rogers left her house with 7 small boxes of mints, Spokane police finally knew, with scientific certainty, exactly who had killed her. Now, remember that stain on Candy's clothing, the grape gum the suspect had pointed to for decades? That theory had led investigators in exactly the wrong direction for 60 years. And remember those investigators back in 1959, carefully preserving evidence they had absolutely no way to test? That quiet, almost invisible act of diligence was the only reason any of this was possible at all. 2 decisions, made decades apart, finally intersecting in a Spokane crime lab in September 2021. So, who was John Ray Hoff? He was born on August 11, 1938, and grew up on the 2500 block of West College Avenue, a Spokane native, raised in the same city where he would eventually take Candy's life. Even before 1959, his life had a pattern investigators would later find chilling in hindsight. At 16 years old, in 1955, Hoff escaped from a state boys training camp near Olympia, Washington. He made it as far as Yakima before authorities caught him, along with 3 other boys who'd escaped with him. He entered the U.S. Army at 17 and was assigned to a Nike missile site tasked with protecting Fairchild Air Force Base, the very same base whose airmen had died searching for Candy, whose helicopters had scanned the woods where her body would eventually be found, whose personnel had discovered her shoes on Old Trails Road. Hoff wasn't a stranger lurking at the edge of this story. He was embedded inside it, connected to nearly every institution that searched for the girl he'd killed. On March 6, 1959, the day Candy disappeared, Hoff was 20 years old, living at 2211 West Broadway Avenue, just a short distance from her home on West Mission Avenue. And here's the detail that makes this entire case feel almost impossibly small, almost designed by some cruel coincidence. Hoff had a stepsister, 10 years old at the time, who was active in the Camp Fire Girls organization. She had personally served as Candy's big sister, a mentor figure assigned to look out for the younger bluebirds. It's unclear whether Hoff ever knew Candy directly, but his own family was woven into the exact organization she belonged to, at the exact moment he took her life. That should have been enough to put him on someone's list in 1959. It wasn't. He simply walked away. And then, 2 years later, in 1961, Hoff did something that reads less like an isolated crime and more like a confession written in behavior rather than words. He attacked a woman in Spokane, forcibly removed her clothing, used her own garments to tie her up, and strangled her, just as he had with Candy. This time, though, his victim survived. Hoff was arrested, convicted of second-degree assault, and served 6 months in jail. 6 months. For an attack that, on paper, mirrored a child's murder in almost every detail. Nobody connected the dots. Not then. There was no reason to. His name had never been in the Rogers file to begin with. Hoff went on to marry, have a daughter, and live out the rest of a short, troubled life. On June 30, 1970, at 31 years old, John Ray Hoff died by suicide, a gunshot to the head, at his home on the 5000 block of West Rosewood. He was pronounced dead at Holy Family Hospital. He died believing, presumably, that what he'd done to a 9-year-old girl 11 years earlier would go with him to the grave. It very nearly did. On November 19, 2021, the Spokane Police Department held a news conference to formally announce what their investigators, their forensic partners, and a grieving city had waited 62 years to hear. Police Chief Craig Meadle told reporters it was his hope that solving the case would bring, in his words, a measure of comfort and closure to Candy's family and to the community that had never stopped carrying this with them. Detective Zach Storment, the man who had led the modern investigation, described what the case had meant to the department across generations. He called it the Mount Everest of Spokane's cold cases, the one they could never seem to overcome. But, he added, nobody ever forgot. There would be no trial. No courtroom reckoning. No moment where Candy's family got to watch the man responsible face a judge. John Ray Hoff had escaped every form of earthly justice by dying 51 years before anyone learned his name. The only verdict Spokane would ever get was a DNA report and a grave exhumed under a court order. Proof, finally, but not punishment. And maybe that's the part of this story that lingers longest. For 62 years, the not knowing was its own kind of sentence. For Candy's family, for the detectives who inherited a case they couldn't solve, for a city that changed the way it let its children walk to school because of one Friday afternoon in March. The answer, when it came, didn't undo any of that. It couldn't. What it did was close a door that had been left open for 6 decades, hanging on nothing but hope and old, carefully preserved evidence that a handful of investigators in 1959 had the foresight to save, for a future none of them would live to see. Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She had 7 boxes of mints and a route she knew by heart. And it took 62 years, 3 brothers, 1 daughter's courage, and a single exhumed grave to finally bring her home an answer. So what do we actually take from a story like this? Not just the facts, the lessons. Because a case like Candy Rogers isn't just a mystery that got solved. It's a 62-year case study in how justice can fail, how it can eventually succeed, and everything in between. Here are 6 lessons this case leaves behind. In 1959, the detectives working Candy's case had no idea what DNA even was. The double helix structure had only been discovered 6 years earlier, and forensic DNA testing wouldn't exist for another 3 decades. And yet, someone in that department made the quiet, unglamorous decision to carefully bag and preserve a biological sample from her clothing, evidence they had absolutely no way to use, for a technology that didn't exist yet, on the off chance it might matter someday. It mattered. 62 years later, that single decision was the reason this case could be solved at all. Think about what that means. Those investigators worked their entire careers, retired, and in many cases died, without ever knowing whether their diligence would pay off. They preserved evidence on faith alone, faith that science would eventually catch up to the crime. It did. This is the lesson every investigator, every archivist, every institution should carry forward. You don't get to know which piece of evidence will be the one that matters in 60 years. So you treat all of it like it might be. For decades, Spokane believed it had its man in Hugh Morse, a known killer, already behind bars, with a habit of chewing grape gum that seemed to line up with a stain on Candy's clothing. It was tidy. It was satisfying. It let a city believe the monster was already caged. It was also completely wrong. And here's the real cost of that wrong theory. While investigators spent years circling Morse, the actual killer lived freely, married, had a child, and eventually took his own secret to the grave, undisturbed. A weak piece of circumstantial evidence, a smell, a guess, became the gravitational center of an investigation for the better part of half a century. This is confirmation bias in its purest, most consequential form. Once investigators believed they knew the answer, every subsequent decision bent around confirming it rather than testing it. The lesson isn't just for detectives. It's for anyone who's ever mistaken a convenient story for the truth. The moment an explanation feels too satisfying is exactly the moment it deserves the most scrutiny. John Ray Hoff wasn't a stranger lurking on the edge of society. He was a Spokane kid who grew up a few blocks from Candy, whose own stepsister mentored her in the same campfire program, who served the very base whose airmen searched for her, whose life intersected with hers and her community in a dozen quiet, ordinary ways. He wasn't a known predator with a file 6 inches thick. He had a juvenile record, sure, but nothing that screamed this is the man capable of this. That's precisely what made him invisible for 62 years. Detectives were searching for a monster who stood out. What they eventually found was someone who blended in completely, embedded in the same institutions, the same neighborhoods, the same community fabric as everyone else. This case is a hard reminder that violence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's standing close enough to be forgotten entirely, simply because no one thought to look there. Two years after Candy's murder, Hoff attacked another victim, bound her with her own clothing, strangled her, in an assault that mirrored what happened to Candy almost exactly. That victim survived. Hoff served 6 months. 6 months for an attack that, in hindsight, reads like a rehearsal viewed from the wrong angle. Nobody connected it to the Rogers case because there was no reason to. His name had never surfaced. But the pattern was there, sitting in a court record, for anyone who might have thought to look. This is a lesson that echoes across countless cases far beyond this one. Violent behavior is rarely a single, isolated event. It tends to escalate, repeat, and reveal itself in fragments long before the worst version of it occurs, if institutions are paying close enough attention to notice the shape forming. For a family, 62 years of not knowing is an almost unbearable length of time. For forensic science, 62 years was the exact runway it needed. Investigative genetic genealogy, the technology that finally cracked this case, didn't exist in any usable form until the late 2010s. It took degraded, contaminated, 6-decade-old DNA and rebuilt an entire family tree out of it, narrowing an entire population down to 3 brothers and, ultimately, 1 name. Cases like this are why cold case units exist at all, even when the odds of solving any individual file look close to zero. Somewhere, right now, there's a piece of evidence sitting in a police department freezer that the current technology can't touch, but the next technology might. This case is proof that unsolved is not the same as unsolvable. It just means the right tool hasn't been built yet. When investigators approached Hoff's daughter, Kathy, she had every reason to protect herself from what that DNA test might reveal about her own father. Instead, she volunteered it, knowingly walking toward an answer that could only be devastating, because she understood that a family on the other side of this case had been waiting 62 years for the truth. That's not a small thing. It takes a specific kind of courage to hand over the piece of evidence that might permanently rewrite how you understand your own father, not for yourself, but for a stranger's grief you'll never fully witness. Candy's case wasn't solved by chance. It was solved because, at nearly every turn, someone chose to do the harder, more honest thing. Investigators who preserved evidence for a future they'd never see, a detective who refused to let the file gather dust, and a daughter who chose truth over comfort. Candy Rogers left her house on a Friday afternoon with 7 boxes of mints and never made it home. It took 62 years, 3 brothers, 1 exhumed grave, and 1 daughter's courage to finally give her family an answer. Not justice. Hoff never faced a courtroom, never answered for what he did. But an answer. And sometimes, after 62 years of silence, an answer is the closest thing to justice a family is ever going to get. If this case stayed with you, hit the like button. It genuinely helps the story reach the people who need to hear it. Drop a comment. What part of Candy's story hit you hardest? The mint boxes on the road, the helicopter crash, or the 62-year wait for an answer? And if you want more true crime cases uncovered with this level of research and detail, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because there are stories just as haunting, and just as important to tell, still coming. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there.